Hello and welcome to Our American States, a podcast from the National Conference of State Legislatures. I'm your host, Ed Smith.
And so the whole goal behind this is to really open up the conversation about how we track success in the justice system so that we can have a comprehensive view of what's happening to individuals across different stages, as well as having comparability across jurisdictions.
That was Mike Mueller-Smith, an associate professor of economics at the University of Michigan and one of my guests on this podcast. He's joined by Senator Barry Usher of Montana, who serves as Majority Whip and is the president of NCSL. The focus of this podcast is how to use criminal justice data to better understand how a range of programs affect people in the justice system, and how policymakers can use such data to decide which programs to support. Criminal justice data in the U.S. is fragmented. Traditionally, there's been no structure to collect and integrate data in a consistent fashion that would allow policymakers to see trends across the states, regions, and the nation. Mueller-Smith is the director of the Criminal Justice Administrative Record System, or CJARS, which is a joint project between the University of Michigan and the U.S. Census Bureau. The decade-old effort seeks to modernize the data reporting and collection and allow policymakers to track people from their first encounter with the justice system through the eventual resolution of their case. Mueller-Smith explained how the project came to be and how legislators and others in state government and beyond can use it. Senator Usher, who chairs the Senate Judiciary Committee, has been a long-time advocate for collecting and using criminal justice data to better inform policy. He discussed legislation passed in Montana and how he thinks it will help the state better evaluate criminal justice programs in the future. Here's our discussion, starting with Mike Mueller-Smith. Mike, welcome to the podcast. Great to have you.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, Mike, why don't you tell listeners a little bit about your background and the research you've done related to the criminal justice system?
So I'm an economist at the University of Michigan, and I'm really interested in questions around crime and justice in the United States, particularly how it intersects with issues of socio and economic factors in people's lives, the role of socioeconomic policy as a crime prevention tool, and the broader ramifications that justice policy has on American communities.
I don't think I've done a podcast in quite a long time where at some point the value of solid data was not discussed. So in that light, tell us about CJARS, the Criminal Justice Administrative Record System. How does that work?
CJARS is a project that I started when I first arrived at Michigan. We are now in our 10th year of operating, which is really exciting. And the goal is really to try to transform our capacity for research and statistical reporting on the U.S. criminal justice system. What we do in collaboration with the U.S. Census Bureau is collect data from across the United States. The U.S. has a highly decentralized and federated criminal justice system. And so I have a team that reaches out to sheriffs, police, criminal courts, departments of corrections to bring their data here to the University of Michigan, where a group of data scientists work on harmonizing it into the same format and language. Simple things that you normally wouldn't worry about for the operational use of criminal justice data, like there are 1,000 ways to abbreviate or misspell marijuana. When we're going to put that to research use, we have to create that into a systematic and consistent format. And so we work together to create one kind of harmonized data product, which then we make available through secure channels to researchers to study and analyze. And what's exciting about the partnership with the U.S. Census Bureau is that through the Federal Statistical Research Data Center system, all of this criminal justice data can be linked at the individual level with things like economic outcomes, like earnings and employment trajectories for individuals, or like what led up to their involvement in the justice system in the first place, or decennial census data to think about the family linkages and what happens to kids when somebody goes to prison, or mortality records. It really opens up our capacity to think through new and important questions that people have wondered about for a long time, but we haven't yet had concrete evidence on.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's certainly a different way to look at criminal justice system and data about how it affects all these other factors, and not something I think a lot of us do think about.
Well, it kind of seems silly if we are tying our own hands, if we aren't leveraging the full potential arsenal of policies. There's an important role for social policy, for economic policy as a crime prevention tool. Why limit ourselves to just law enforcement and sentencing, which obviously have their place in how we combat crime, but why not take a holistic approach to see where we can get the best bang for our buck in terms of crime prevention?
I understand that you shared this tool, and more specifically, the Justice Outcomes Explorer, with some NCSL members at a meeting last year. And what is the Justice Outcomes Explorer, and how did the audience respond? I've been to many, many of these meetings, and sometimes it's like meh when people hear a presenter, but I had the indication that they were a little more enthusiastic about this.
The Justice Outcomes Explorer, Joe, is a product that we launched a few years ago that we're really excited about. Now, CJARS, I'm a data nerd. I am thrilled by the opportunity
I got that.
to go in to, a secure basement facility to work with these confidential records and go through the entire federal background process and research approval process that the federal government has. Not a lot of people, and especially policymakers, don't have the time and patience to deal with an 18-month application process to work with confidential data. And they don't necessarily need to have access to that kind of microdata. So the whole idea behind the Justice Outcomes Explorer is, we have the expertise and the experience of putting all of these data together and the approvals. Why don't we start to produce new statistical series that share information at the aggregate level that people like policymakers or reporters on the justice system can just log in from a public website to check out? And so what we do is systematically go through and say, okay, for a cohort of prisoners who were released in, let's say, Texas in 2010, what was their 1-year employment rates, their 3-year employment rates, their 5-year employment rates? And it's not just that, it's how many have died, or what share are recidivating with kind of consistent definitions across jurisdictions. And so the whole goal behind this is to really open up the conversation about how we track success in the justice system so that we can have a comprehensive view of what's happening to individuals across different stages, as well as having comparability across jurisdictions. One of the really challenging things, if you are a close reader of criminal justice policy and recidivism, is it seems like each agency, each jurisdiction sometimes has its favorite definition of recidivism. It's kind of this amorphous topic. We all kind of agree, it's some dimension of potentially reoffending, but definitions can include return to prison or new arrest or a new conviction. And we aren't going to kind of take a stance on which is the correct definition. We're just going to give consistent definitions across jurisdictions so that you can have an apples to apples comparison. And that's important if we're going to try to, use the laboratory of the United States, where we have all of this amazing and rich policy variation, to try to learn what can actually be the most effective and efficient use of public funds. Should we use more pretrial diversion programs? Is that going to lower recidivism rates? Or will investments in proactive policing programs be more effective? That's the kind of debate that I think should be grounded in empirical evidence. And the reaction was very enthusiastic. I have to say, there were a lot of people in the audience who talked about how this was the kind of data that they're always asking their agencies to produce. And this is kind of the first time that they're seeing this consistently reported and kind of a user-friendly online portal. And I say that not with, criticism of these agencies. We're linking data that often they don't have access to themselves, and they aren't necessarily funded to have the internal capacity to produce this kind of information. And so, we're happy to play that intermediary role of facilitating data linkage and the production of statistics that are really important for kind of governance and accountability.
Tell me about what the folks at that meeting said was the most valuable thing for them. How would this inform policy and maybe legislation?
Well, I think this helps provide, again, like a more holistic view of what's happening to cohorts of individuals going through the justice system. There's a tendency sometimes to judge crime and justice policies around what's most easily measurable within that domain, things like crime rates and recidivism outcomes, caseload sizes, that kind of stuff. I'm not saying that that's not important. That is absolutely a first order importance. But as we know from conversations over the last decade, that is just one aspect through which crime and justice policy affect society. And being able to actually attach numbers, things like the share of individuals who are getting covered with health insurance after states have undertaken efforts to expand Medicaid access, actually being able to tie that to outcomes is really important because we live in an age where there is growing data and capacity, and our expectation should be that policy is being grounded in evidence. And I think that's what legislators face. And so this gives them the capacity to enter that kind of policy debate with evidence in hand.
It's certainly important for legislators, legislative staff to be able to get access to this material and understand it. Why is it important for the public more generally to have that information? I guess that's partly through journalism, but just for people to be able to look these things up and think about it for themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two ways of thinking about this. There's a lot of public frustration with how the justice system is operating sometimes. And I see this from two perspectives. One is about inefficiency or ineffective policy. And there are lots of examples that we can point to where good ideas haven't played out in the way that we have expected. And then there's kind of another camp that really cares deeply about accountability, about the collateral consequences of the justice system, and how this is potentially reshaping American communities for generations. This kind of public transparency around caseloads and the outcomes they experience can help us all kind of better educate ourselves about the justice system and hold policymakers accountable to steer them towards legislation and policy that we find to be most effective towards achieving those goals, having the best impact on society for the least cost. The goal is really to improve public education as well.
As we wrap up here, Mike, we've of course got legislators, legislative staff in our audience. What kind of final thoughts would you have for them on this issue?
One of the biggest challenges that we face in running CJARS is getting data in the door. I think that there's way more pent-up demand for this kind of data, and getting data at scale across the entire United States is really necessary in order to understand the lay of the land, as well as to leverage some of these kind of cross-jurisdiction natural experiments that exist so that we can understand what policies are effective. And so one of the biggest challenges that we face is just building partnerships with state and local agencies. So as a legislator, you can support that through either reaching out to CJARS directly, which would be awesome. We always welcome direct partnerships with local officials and state officials. But another thing that we did last year is we built out, in collaboration with some additional researchers, a piece of model legislation that was approved by the American Legislative Exchange Council and their Judiciary Subcommittee. It's a model piece of legislation for researcher data access. And so this is something that you could consider proposing in your local jurisdiction as a way to help lower barriers for researchers to get access to data and help us all advance towards a better evidence base to improve policy going forward.
Great. So more effort at the legislative level in terms of making this data more easily available so that you data nerds can go ahead and take it and crunch it and get it into a form that everybody can benefit from.
When I got a PhD in economics, I was not trained to navigate the legal landscape of data requests and the soft skills of negotiating data access provisions with potentially sensitive legal teams. These are skills that I have worked and my team has worked to develop, but you can make it easier for us so that we can focus on what we do best, which is crunching the numbers, and maybe not having the political savvy to negotiate data access hurdles.
All right. Well, thank you, Mike. I really appreciate that, and good suggestion for our audience. Take care.
Thanks so much.
I'll be right back after this short break with Senator Barry Usher of Montana.
When it comes to podcasts, only one organization, NCSL, keeps a focus on the people, policy, and politics of state legislatures. Each episode of our podcast offers behind-the-scenes insights into the legislative process. First, the program Our American States provides in-depth discussions twice a month on key state policy issues shaping our nation. Or explore bipartisan dialogue with our special series Across the Aisle, where diverse political perspectives converge to create constructive conversations in state legislative chambers. And for history buffs, we've also produced a 6-part series called Building Democracy, the Story of State Legislatures. Listen to learn more about the creation and development of the first branch of government in the United States. Stay connected, stay informed. Subscribe to these programs now on your favorite podcast platform. Learn more at ncsl.org.
Senator Usher, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Ed.
To start out, maybe you could tell our listeners a little bit about your background and how you came to work in the criminal justice area for quite a while there in the Senate.
My background prior to being a legislator is I was a law enforcement officer in 2 different states. Actually, I started in the Coast Guard chasing drug runners around the Caribbean. And then I went to Virginia, Fairfax County, and then I went over to Maryland. Then when I got into the legislature, they tapped my experience from being in law enforcement on the Judiciary Committee in the House. My second session, I became Vice Chair of Judiciary. In my third session, I became Chair. When I moved over to the Senate, I went straight into Vice Chair. And my second session, I became Chair of Senate Judiciary.
Of course, we're talking today about criminal justice data. You've been a champion and a leader in this space for quite some time. And I wonder if you could talk about why you've put so much effort into this and why it's so important.
Obviously, criminal justice is my passion and my expertise. But, the big picture is that it's the second largest budget item in the state after Department of Health and Human Services. It seems that we were getting bills and have decisions before us, and I didn't think that we had enough information to make informed decisions. So I said, we need to come up with some way to be able to figure out how we can make decisions with the proper information. I'd ask questions. Most data is not the same, whether it comes from law enforcement, corrections, judiciary, county attorneys. It's not the same data, even though it may be the same people involved. And I wanted a way to be able to put that all in one place and be able to pull it out together as one data set to be able to make informed decisions.
I think every podcast I've done this year, I've had a discussion about data and having it in a usable form. And exactly to your point that you have data that's coming in, it's from credible sources, but it's not formatted the same way. And some of the classifications may be different. Let's talk a little bit about what it looks like on the ground in Montana. I wonder if you could talk a little about the legislation related to this that's gone through in your state and how it's working. How do you see it functioning?
Well, and first, we started off with HJ 31 in 2021, which was a study to see if we would be able to do some sort of data warehouse or collect all the data properly and be able to put it in one place and bring it out. So we did that study. Like I said, that was HJ 31 in 2021. And then from there, we also looked at what other states were doing. And a lot of other states were doing just a portion of the data, whether or not they were just collecting all the court data or another state was collecting all the Department of Corrections data. So with the vision that I had, we created SB 11 in 2023. I took the bold step of saying we're going to take all criminal justice data. So from the first contact with a police officer out on the street to as far as if you did go to prison and you come out and you get off of any probation and parole. So I wanted the data from one end to the other end. And like I said, most other states that we looked at during the study were doing portions of that. I said, we need to be bold. If we're going to do it, we're going to go all in. When you compromise in the legislature, you start big and you end up getting small. But I was able to convince everybody to stick with the bigger, larger, bold, let's get it done. Let's do it better than anybody else. And actually, the Department of Justice, U.S. Department of Justice, started looking at what we were doing too. And they were very interested in what we were doing. Then in 2025, we passed HB 117 to pretty much continue on the work, continue the funding. And the way we set it up was through Criminal Justice Oversight. Council would have the oversight with the Board of Crime Control actually doing the work. And they hired people, data analysts. Did a lot of discussion with the Chief Information Officer for the state. We also had Board of Crime Control. We really wanted and we felt very confident in the director at the time, Board of Crime Control, to be able to get this going. We got her involved in the initial meetings too before we got all these bills through. I got law enforcement on board. I pretty much got meetings with everybody that would be involved on different levels in the room, Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association, the County Attorneys Association, the court administrator. We got them all in the same room and just said, here's the vision, here's the bill, what do we need to do? The biggest thing and the biggest pushback we got was everybody was concerned about the unfunded mandate. So I made it very clear in the bill that the state was going to pay for everything. And the original budget, I think we put on for the first 2 years was $1.5 million, and we only used a couple $100,000. So it's been able to go pretty smoothly since then. And but those are the bills that we put together to make sure that it would work.
Well, that was quite an effort you described there, and I wonder what the long-term goal is here. How does this help you as legislators or the people in the executive branch make better decisions about the criminal justice system?
The vision behind it is it'll all be autonomized, so there won't be any names attached to the data, but we should be able to follow someone based on what programs they got into, what type of interaction they had with the police officer, what kind of things that county attorneys offered them before they went to court, then the court process. And then, if the courts decided they needed to go to anger management or addiction services or to prison, we can track people to find out what programming they got. And then based on what programming they got, what their outcome was. And if their outcome was positive and they went to these two programs and everybody else that went to those two programs came out positive, then those are things that we should continue to fund in the future. But if we see that certain people went to a different program and they were all negative outcomes and there was a lot of recidivism with the people that went to this one specific program, then maybe that's a program we either need to change or not stop funding and stop sending people to those programs. So that's probably the biggest thing that we see as the vision of how this data is going to help is what programs work, what programs don't work, or combination of programs. It could be repetitive. This person went, or these 8 people went to this program twice, and the second time it actually worked. And so they did not come back into the system. But if 10 people went to this one program and every single one of them came back into the system, then that's probably not a good program.
The implementation of legislation almost always takes more time than any of us would probably like. And I just wonder, when you look at where you are now, how confident are you that you're getting the outcomes that you're hoping for?
I would say that we're still in the pilot gathering stage. The first interim from 2023 to 25, we had set it up that we were going to collect the data from 3 counties, and the counties being every law enforcement in that county, the county attorneys in that county, and the judicial system in that county. So in that first interim, we were able to get actually 2 counties. The third one has been started in this interim. But in addition to that, we've also downloaded all of Department of Corrections, all of Office of Public Defenders, and we've also been able to test out different softwares because, every single one of these counties, county attorneys, they have different software systems that they collect their data on. And with that said, we've been able to narrow, one, the cost of collecting the data and the processes. So it should start going a lot quicker. I know the last report I got probably, I think in April, and they were just getting ready to start downloading some of the statewide court data. Like I said, they were already on that 3rd county and trying to figure out who the 4th and 5th counties are going to be. So I think we're still in the collection time, and I think that's probably the hardest thing. When we were back in 2025, people were scratching their heads saying, should we continue to fund this? We haven't gotten any information out. We haven't gotten anything out. And, that's the most difficult thing, is trying to convince other legislators that we may not get anything out, for 4 years, 5 years. It's going to take a long time to be able to get this data. But once we get that link going for each one of these entities, then we'll be able to automatically download their stuff in the future. So it'll update on itself. And then what I think we're working on now is trying to figure out what questions, a sample of questions that we want the data to answer for us in the future, which we've been working on that since the beginning in 2021. And we do have a list already put together on what some of those questions are.
I've always thought that one of the most challenging things about being a legislator is if you're writing and passing really good legislation, you're probably going to be gone long before it actually comes to fruition, before you see the final effects, because that's just the nature of ambitious legislation. Let me ask you this as we finish up. Colleagues around the country listen to the podcast, and I wonder if they're interested in this area. Where would you tell them to start? How should they start thinking about trying to collect this kind of data and put it into a format that they can use?
Well, I think, even since we started the discussion prior to the 2021 session. I think some of the key things that I can say that we've had success with is, one, I got people in the room that were going to be involved in not only the collection of the data, but who we were going to get the data from, to try and make sure that we took care of any objections before we passed the bill. I mean, we literally had a couple meetings in a room that had 4 walls with whiteboards, and we just started drawing things out and trying to figure out together what obstacles we may come up against, not just in the legislation, but in the technology. And since that 2021, since we did the study, I can tell you that technology, as you know, changes daily, weekly, monthly. So things that we talked about, in 2020 and 2021 are no issues today. We've got a cloud, so we can, and the cloud is getting cheaper by the day. So we're able to throw all this into a cloud. As far as other obstacles were, whether or not criminal justice data should be shared with, different people that may not have the same confidential requirements to get data. And we've been able to overcome that issue. That's the biggest thing is, one, figure out what your vision is. Two, get everybody in the room. And then three, make sure you continue to have the conversation so people I don't want to say get bored with it, but get complacent. It needs to be top of mind. Every time we have a Criminal Justice Oversight Council meeting, every time we have a Law and Justice Interim Committee meeting, we're bringing this up and asking for a report just so it's top of mind to everybody. So people don't think that this data warehouse is stale and it's gone by the wayside. We need to continue to fund it, but we also need to continue to work it to make sure that it will fit the needs in the future. And you're right, this will go, I may never see the data come out, because I'll be gone from the legislature, but it is going to go on as long as we have people that champion it and continue on to make sure that it doesn't just die by the wayside.
Well, Senator, thanks so much. I really appreciate you sharing your perspective. Take care.
Thank you.
I've been talking with Mike Mueller-Smith from the University of Michigan and Montana Senator Barry Usher about the use of criminal justice data to craft better policy. Thanks for listening. Search for NCSL podcasts wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast, Our American States, dives into some of the most challenging public policy issues facing legislators. Also check out our special series, Building Democracy, on the history of legislatures.